Blood rains from the skies as a father's fists shatter mountains and tear through civilizations. A warrior bred for conquest, Omni-Man was sent to Earth with a mission to prepare humanity for total submission. But when the time came, he chose slaughter over subjugation, leaving the planet's greatest heroes broken and his own son gasping for air in a city reduced to rubble. Beyond the bloodshed lies a greater war, one that stretches across the cosmos, where Viltrumites rule with an iron fist and rebellions are crushed before they begin. But what happens when their strongest soldier turns against them? From the massacre that shook the world to the rise of a reluctant emperor, Omni-Man's story is one of power, betrayal, and redemption. The Invincible universe is filled with secrets, hidden wars, ancient bloodlines, and a looming battle that could reshape existence itself. This is the story of the deadliest man in the galaxy. The Viltrumites were not born into peace. They did not build their empire through diplomacy or mutual understanding. Their civilization was carved from the bones of the weak, forged in the fires of endless war, and sustained by a belief so absolute that it became the foundation of their existence. Only the strong deserved to survive. From the moment a Viltrumite child could stand, they were taught this truth. Strength was not just an advantage. It was the only thing that mattered. Their society was built upon relentless competition, where weakness was a crime punishable by death. If a warrior showed hesitation, they were executed. If they could not meet the expectations of their superiors, they were cast aside, wiped from existence as though they had never been born. The Viltrumites saw this as natural selection, a cleansing process that ensured only the most powerful among them would rise. Nolan was born into this brutal world, and from his earliest days, he understood that survival was not guaranteed. It was earned. The blood of his ancestors ran through his veins, warriors who had fought and killed to maintain the supremacy of their race. Every day of his childhood was a test. He was trained to fight before he even had the strength to lift a weapon, forced to battle against others who, like him, were expected to prove themselves or die trying. He learned quickly that mercy did not exist in Viltrumite culture. To hesitate was to invite death. To falter was to prove oneself unworthy. By the time Nolan reached adolescence, the Viltrumites were already engaged in the violent expansion of their empire. The galaxy was theirs to take, and nothing would stop them. Entire civilizations crumbled before their might, their people slaughtered or enslaved, their planets repurposed to serve Viltrumite needs. Nolan witnessed these conquests firsthand. He saw cities reduced to dust, heard the cries of those who dared resist, and understood that this was the natural order of the universe. The strong ruled and the weak perished. As he grew older, Nolan became a soldier in the Viltrumite war machine. He was tested in battle, forced to prove his worth in combat against foes who had no chance of victory. He crushed those who opposed him, honing his skills with every life he took. His strength grew, his reflexes sharpened, and his mind became hardened to the realities of war. He fought alongside legends, warriors who had wiped out entire species with their bare hands, who had reshaped the very fabric of galactic history through sheer brutality. But for all their strength, even the Viltrumites were not invincible. The war that had defined their expansion was not without cost. Though they were far superior to any race they encountered, the constant battles, the endless cycles of conquest and extermination, had begun to take a toll on their numbers. Warriors were dying not from disease or old age. Those things were foreign to a Viltrumite's physiology, but from battle, from the sheer intensity of their own ambition. They had pushed too hard, spread themselves too thin, and in their arrogance, they had failed to account for the consequences. The Empire had reached a turning point. The Viltrumites were still the dominant force in the universe, but they could no longer afford to throw themselves into endless wars without a plan. They needed a new strategy, Instead of direct invasions, they would take a more methodical approach. Instead of launching full-scale attacks, they would infiltrate, manipulate, and weaken planets from within. Nolan had proven himself many times over, rising through the ranks with ruthless efficiency. He had killed more enemies than he could count, survived wars that had claimed the lives of warriors stronger than him, and emerged as one of the Empire's most trusted enforcers. He was given a new mission, one that would require patience, deception, and a different kind of strength. He was to travel to a planet called Earth. Unlike the countless worlds the Viltrumites had conquered before, Earth was not to be taken by force, not yet. Instead, Nolan was to integrate himself into their society, to learn their weaknesses, to prepare them for eventual assimilation into the Empire. He was to become one of them, to live among them as their protector, their hero. And when the time came, he would deliver Earth into Viltrumite hands. It was not a mission Nolan questioned. He had spent his entire life following orders, killing without hesitation, serving the Empire without doubt. Earth would fall like every world before it. Humanity would kneel or be destroyed. What he did not yet realize, what he could not yet comprehend, was that this mission would change him in ways he never expected. The Viltrumite Empire was not built through diplomacy, nor did it rise through cooperation or trade. It was forged in war, baptized in blood, and sustained by the unshakable belief that strength was the only truth in the universe. Across countless millennia, it expanded like an unstoppable force, consuming entire civilizations, breaking species beneath its heel, and reshaping entire star systems to fit its will. Where the Viltrumites set foot, resistance crumbled, and those who opposed them met only one fate: annihilation. In the beginning, they were not yet an empire, but a single, unified race living on their homeworld, Viltrum. Their people were unlike any other in the universe, near-immortal beings of immense power, their bodies designed to endure, their strength unmatched. But raw power alone was not enough to create an empire. What made the Viltrumites truly terrifying was their philosophy, the absolute and unwavering belief that weakness had no place in the universe. To them, mercy was a flaw, kindness was a disease, and only the strong deserved to exist. This belief was not merely a cultural idea. It was law, one enforced with ruthless precision. Their history was marked by endless trials, where warriors were forced to prove themselves through combat from the moment they could stand. It was not uncommon for children to be pitted against one another, their battles serving as a test of worthiness. The weak perished, their names forgotten, while the strong carried on, shaping the next generation of conquerors. Even among adults, a single misstep, a single show of hesitation, could mean death at the hands of one's own comrades. There was no room for failure in Viltrumite society. Their civilization thrived on war, and as their numbers grew, so did their ambitions. Their first true conquests were the neighboring planets within their system, worlds inhabited by species that had never known such brutality. Some resisted, attempting to mount defenses, but their weapons were useless against beings who could shatter mountains with a single blow, who could tear through fleets of warships with nothing but their fists. Others attempted to negotiate, to plead for mercy, offering their resources, their knowledge, anything to be spared. The Viltrumites listened, considered their offers, and wiped them out regardless. They had no use for diplomacy. A race that could not defend itself did not deserve to exist. As their empire expanded, so too did their methods. The early days of their conquest were defined by sheer force. Entire civilizations wiped out in days, their planets left barren and uninhabitable. But over time, they realized the flaws in this approach. Eradicating a species meant losing potential labor, resources, and infrastructure. A dead planet was of no use to the Empire, and so they adapted. Instead of extermination, they began subjugation. Planets that surrendered were given a choice: serve the Empire or be destroyed. Those who accepted Viltrumite rule were integrated into the Empire's vast system, their people placed under strict control, their worlds reshaped to fit the needs of their new masters. The Viltrumites established dominion over governments, military forces, and economies, ensuring that every aspect of these societies bent to their will. Those who resisted, however, suffered a fate far worse than death. Entire populations were slaughtered as examples, their leaders executed in full view of their people, their cities reduced to rubble. The Viltrumites did not simply conquer, they broke the will of those they subjugated, ensuring that rebellion was not just impossible, but unthinkable. Across the stars, they became known as gods of destruction, being so powerful and so ruthless that no force in the universe could oppose them. But the Viltrumite expansion was not without its challenges. There were species who refused to bow, civilizations that fought until their last breath. Some were advanced, possessing technology capable of wounding even a Viltrumite. Others were clever, using guerrilla tactics, hiding in the far reaches of space, striking and retreating before they could be caught. For a time, it seemed as though resistance might stand a chance. Then came the Great Purge. The Viltrumites, growing tired of these scattered rebellions, launched a campaign of extermination unlike anything the universe had seen. They hunted down every species that had dared defy them, wiping out entire planets in mere days. The blood of billions soaked the stars, their screams lost in the void as Viltrumite warriors descended upon them like an unstoppable plague. What had once been resistance was now nothing more than memory, erased from history by the overwhelming force of the Empire. It was during this time that the Viltrumites reached the height of their power. They had no true rivals, no enemies capable of standing against them. They spread across the universe like a storm, their empire stretching farther than any before it. They had perfected their method of conquest. Some worlds were taken by force, others through manipulation, their leaders replaced with puppets loyal to Viltrumite rule. And yet, even at the peak of their dominance, a problem arose. For all their strength, their brutality, their sheer unstoppable might, the Viltrumites had one fatal flaw: themselves. Their own philosophy of strength over weakness had led to the death of many of their own warriors. They had slaughtered not only their enemies but also their own people, culling the weak so ruthlessly that their numbers began to dwindle. For all their power, the Viltrumites were not infinite, and their losses were beginning to take a toll. To sustain their empire, they devised a new strategy, one that would change the course of their history. Instead of launching full-scale invasions, they would send lone agents to targeted worlds. These agents, elite Viltrumite warriors, would integrate themselves into alien societies, gain the trust of their people, and subtly weaken them from within. When the time was right, when the planet was at its most vulnerable, the Empire would come to claim it with minimal resistance. It was through this method that a Viltrumite named Nolan was sent to a small, seemingly insignificant planet at the edge of the Empire's reach. Planet called Earth. Nolan Grayson's journey to Earth was not one of desperation or exile. It was a mission, a directive from the Viltrumite Empire itself, a calculated plan to extend their reach without the need for immediate war. The old ways had proven costly. Though the Viltrumites were the most dominant force in the universe, they were not limitless. Their own brutal culling of the weak had left their numbers low, and if they were to continue their conquest, they had to adapt. The strategy was simple: infiltration. Instead of destroying planets outright, they would send warriors to live among alien species, to gain their trust, to become their defenders. And when the time came, when the people had grown to rely on them, the planet would be ripe for assimilation. For Nolan, Earth was just another assignment, another nameless world in the grand expansion of the Viltrumite Empire. He had no emotional ties to it, no personal stake in its future. He was a conqueror trained and conditioned to see the weak as prey, and humanity, fragile, primitive, divided, was weaker than anything he had ever encountered. But this was not a world he would take through force. Not yet. His mission required something different. Patience. He descended upon Earth unseen, arriving in the shadows of the cosmos, watching from above before making his presence known. He observed their civilizations, their cultures, their conflicts. He studied their weaknesses, their need for leadership, their dependence on heroes, their admiration for those who could protect them. And then, when the time was right, he revealed himself. He chose a name, one that would blend into human society: Nolan Grayson. To the world, he was not a conqueror, not a soldier of an empire, but a guardian, a hero. He became Omni-Man, a being of immense power, one who could fly faster than sound, shatter steel with his fists, and stand against threats no human could hope to match. He saved lives, crushed dangers before they could escalate, and established himself as Earth's most powerful protector. The world embraced him. Humanity, ever desperate for figures to worship, welcomed him as a savior. He had no need to impose his will through force. They accepted him willingly. Governments recognized his strength, but they did not dare challenge him. They had seen what he could do, and they knew that if he ever chose to turn against them, there would be nothing they could do to stop him. So they cooperated. But Nolan was not merely an observer. He had to become one of them, to embed himself into their world so deeply that they would never suspect his true intentions. And so, he did something unexpected, something that would change the course of his mission forever. He fell in love. Debbie was unlike anyone he had ever known. She was not a warrior, not a conqueror, not someone who could stand against the might of a Viltrumite. She was human in every sense of the word, fragile, mortal, and yet stronger in ways Nolan did not expect. She challenged him, questioned him, made him think in ways he never had before. With her, he built something he had never imagined he would: a home. They married, and for the first time in his long existence, Nolan experienced something foreign to him. A life that was not dictated by war, by orders, by the endless pursuit of conquest. He lived among humans not as a conqueror, but as a husband, a father. When Mark was born, Nolan looked upon his son with expectation. This was not just a child, this was the next step in the Viltrumite plan. Mark was proof that their race could spread in ways beyond war. He would grow strong, inherit his father's power, and one day he would fight alongside him to bring Earth into the fold of the Empire. And yet, something strange happened. The more time Nolan spent on Earth, the more he lived this life, the more he began to question. He had been raised in a world where strength was the only measure of worth, where weakness was a death sentence. And yet, here was a world that defied those beliefs. Humanity was weak, there was no denying that. They could not fly, they could not fight, they could not stand against the might of a single Viltrumite. But they endured. They built families, created art, found joy in things that had nothing to do with power or survival. They were fragile, yet they persisted. For years, Nolan buried these thoughts, refusing to acknowledge them, convincing himself that he was merely playing a role, that his mission had not changed. He trained Mark, waiting for the day his powers would awaken, preparing him for the truth that one day they would rule this planet together. But deep down, a conflict began to grow, one that he did not fully understand, one that terrified him in ways he could not admit. The mission had been simple, but Earth, in all its weakness, had done something no planet had ever done before. It had made him question everything. Nolan Grayson was a man living two lives, bound by a mission that demanded loyalty to the Viltrumite Empire and a life that asked him to embrace something he had never known before: genuine connection. To the world, he was Omni-Man, the most powerful being on the planet, a hero who stood above all others, protecting humanity from threats beyond their comprehension. But behind closed doors, he was a husband to Debbie and a father to Mark, a man who sat at the dinner table, told stories of his supposed past as an author, and played the role of a devoted family man. For years, he walked the razor's edge between these two identities. His mission was clear. He was not sent to Earth to be a savior, nor to truly assimilate. He was here to prepare the planet for Viltrumite rule. When the time was right, Earth would be brought to its knees, its people would be given the choice to serve or die, and Nolan would stand at the forefront of its conquest, ensuring that his empire's will was carried out. Everything he did, every life he saved, every moment of kindness he showed was, at its core, a carefully constructed lie. But the more he lived among them, the more those lies became difficult to separate from reality. In battle, he was a force unlike anything Earth had ever seen. His presence alone was enough to turn the tide against world-ending threats. When alien invaders descended upon the planet, he was the first to take the fight to them, tearing through their warships with a level of precision that was almost surgical. When kaiju-like monsters rampaged through cities, he met them head-on, reducing them to nothing more than shattered bone and dust. He had fought off countless extraterrestrial threats, warlords from beyond the stars, and even interdimensional conquerors who sought to claim Earth as their own. In every conflict, he was a titan among men, indomitable, unbreakable. To the people of Earth, he was a guardian unlike any other, one who needed no reward, no recognition. He operated beyond politics, beyond national allegiance. He was a protector of all, answering only to himself. No government dared to question him, for they knew that he was beyond their control. They had seen what he was capable of. They understood that if he ever turned on them, there would be nothing they could do to stop him. And yet, he had never given them reason to fear him. He played his role to perfection, ensuring that humanity saw him as their ultimate savior. But when the battles were over, when the dust had settled, he returned home, not as Omni-Man, but as Nolan Grayson. The transition was seamless. In one moment, he was in the heart of battle, his fists drenched in the blood of creatures that dared threaten his world. In the next, he was walking through the front door of his suburban home, kissing Debbie on the cheek and sitting down for dinner as if he had merely returned from a day of writing. Debbie had always been sharp. She knew he was different, that he carried a weight on his shoulders he never spoke about. He had told her his version of the truth, that he was an alien from a far-off world, that he had come to Earth to protect it, to watch over its people. But he had never told her why. She had accepted this, loved him despite the gaps in his past, despite the moments where he seemed distant, lost in thoughts he would never share. With Mark, things were different. His son was not just a part of this life, he was part of the mission. Mark was the key to securing Earth's future under Viltrumite rule, a child born with the potential to become something greater than any human could ever dream of. Nolan watched him closely, waiting for the day his powers would awaken, anticipating the moment when he would finally be able to reveal the truth of their heritage. In the early years, Mark was just a boy, unaware of the weight of his lineage. Nolan played the role of the encouraging father, teaching him discipline, pushing him to be strong, to stand up for himself. He never coddled him, never allowed him to indulge in weakness. He was always present, yet always distant, ensuring that Mark understood the values he believed in: strength, resilience, control. And yet, despite his best efforts to remain detached, something inside him began to shift. He had been raised to believe that weakness was something to be eradicated, that emotions were a hindrance, that attachment was a liability. But watching Mark grow, seeing the way he looked up to him with admiration, the way he sought his approval, it stirred something deep within him. a part of him that he had long since buried, a part of him that had no place in the Viltrumite way. There were moments, brief and fleeting, where he questioned himself. Sitting on the couch with Debbie, watching a movie he didn't care about, but enjoying the warmth of her beside him. Helping Mark with schoolwork, knowing full well that his son's struggles were meaningless compared to the trials he would one day face, and yet feeling a strange sense of pride in his efforts. Walking through the streets of the city he had sworn to protect, seeing people live their lives, laughing, loving, building things not out of necessity, but out of passion. It was weakness. He knew that. It was the very thing the Viltrumites sought to destroy, the very reason they had conquered world after world. And yet, for all his strength, for all his discipline, he could not deny that he felt something for this planet. Something he was never meant to feel. But the mission had not changed. No matter how deeply he embedded himself in this life, no matter how real it felt, he knew that the day would come when Earth would be forced to submit. And when that time came, he would have to make a choice. Would he remain loyal to the empire that had shaped him? Or had this world, in all its fragility, in all its imperfections, already begun to claim him as its own? Nolan had always known this day would come. He had waited, watched, anticipating the moment when his son would finally step into the legacy that had been laid before him. Mark had always been different, carrying within him the potential for something far greater than the human life he had been living. But until now, that potential had remained dormant. There had been no signs, no strength beyond that of a normal boy, no speed, no flight, no evidence of the power that lay within his blood. For years, Nolan had been patient, carefully laying the foundation of what Mark would one day become. He had never been overly affectionate, nor had he been harsh. He was a presence, a force in Mark's life that guided him without fully revealing his true purpose. He spoke often of responsibility, of strength, of what it meant to be more than human. He pushed Mark to be disciplined, to take pride in his actions, to prepare himself for challenges that no ordinary boy could comprehend. And then, one night, everything changed. It was late, long after the city had gone to sleep. Nolan had already retired to his study, Debbie in bed, the quiet hum of suburban life settling into stillness. And then, outside, the sound of something breaking through the air, a rush of wind followed by a sharp impact. He knew before even rising from his chair. The time had come. Stepping out into the cool night, he found Mark standing in the backyard, his breath heavy, his fists clenched, his entire body shaking with the weight of what had just happened. The trash bag he had been carrying lay split open on the ground, garbage scattered around it, but that wasn't what mattered. Mark had thrown it, not just a few feet, not just across the yard. He had thrown it with enough force that it had soared high above the rooftops before gravity had finally reclaimed it. The realization was written all over his face. He had his powers. For Nolan, there was no celebration, no outward display of excitement. He simply stepped forward, placing a firm hand on his son's shoulder. His voice was calm, controlled. You're going to need to learn how to use them. Training began immediately. There was no easing into it, no adjustment period. Mark's childhood had ended the moment his powers awakened. Nolan had spent years waiting for this, and now that the moment had arrived, he wasted no time. The first lesson was flight. It was the most basic skill, and yet, for Mark, it was an entirely new experience. He was clumsy at first, uncertain of his body in the air, unable to control his momentum. Nolan watched as his son wobbled midair, struggling to maintain stability, nearly crashing back to the ground more than once. There was no coddling, no reassurance. "You're overthinking it," Nolan said. "It's not about effort. It's about letting yourself do it. You were made for this." Mark tried again, and again, Each time, Nolan corrected him, never with frustration, but with the cold efficiency of a teacher molding a student. By the end of the session, Mark was hovering, not entirely steady, but no longer fighting against his own instincts. Then came combat. Nolan wasted no time easing Mark into it. There was no slow introduction, no build-up. He struck without warning, a blur of motion that Mark barely had time to react to. The boy was sent sprawling across the field. The wind knocked from his lungs before he even understood what had happened. "Get up," Nolan said, standing over him. Mark groaned, pushing himself up onto his hands and knees. "What the hell, Dad? This isn't a game," Nolan said. "You have to be ready. You're strong now, but strength means nothing if you don't know how to use it." The training was brutal. Nolan did not hold back, nor did he explain himself. Every punch was real, every lesson reinforced with physical consequences. He taught Mark how to take a hit, how to move with his opponent, how to counter and strike with precision. He drilled into him the importance of control, how a single misstep could turn a fight into a massacre. Again and again, Mark was knocked down, sent crashing into the dirt. But each time he rose faster. Each time he adjusted. The boy had spirit, an unwillingness to quit, a determination that burned even through his exhaustion. Nolan recognized it. It was a good sign. But training was not just physical. It was mental. Between their sessions, Nolan spoke of power, of what it meant to be more than human. He planted the seeds of Viltrumite ideology, shaping Mark's understanding of the world in ways that were subtle yet undeniable. "Humanity is fragile," he would say. "They rely on people like us to survive. They don't understand how weak they are, how close they are to losing everything. We protect them, but we are not like them." Mark resisted at first. He had grown up human, had lived among them, had never considered himself anything other than one of them. But as he trained, as he grew stronger, as he realized just how much he outclassed the people around him, those words began to settle into his mind. He saw the way people looked at him differently, the way they feared what he might become, the way they relied on him yet could never truly understand him. Nolan knew he couldn't force Mark to accept his place. That would come in time, but he could guide him, shape his perception, push him toward the inevitable conclusion. And so he continued. Day after day, he trained his son, molding him into something more. The fights grew more intense, the lessons more direct. Mark improved at a staggering rate, his body adapting, his instincts sharpening. He began to understand his strength, to feel the difference between himself and those around him. But there was still resistance, still hesitation. Mark had power, but he did not yet see the world through Viltrumite eyes. Not yet, but Nolan knew. He would. Nolan had never forgotten his true purpose. No matter how many years he spent on Earth, no matter how deeply he embedded himself into the life of a devoted husband and a loving father, his mission had never changed. He had come here not as a guardian, not as a savior, but as an agent of the Viltrumite Empire. Earth was not his home. It was an assignment, a world to be assessed, shaped, and ultimately brought to heal. From the moment he arrived, he had known that the people of this planet were weak. Not just physically, but structurally. Their civilizations were fragile, their governments fractured, their military forces laughable when compared to the might of the Viltrumites. If the Empire truly wanted to, they could have taken Earth in an instant, wiping away all resistance before humanity even realized what had happened. But that was not the way of the Viltrumites. The Empire valued efficiency, not mindless destruction. Earth had potential, and Nolan's task was to prepare it. At first, his actions were subtle. He inserted himself into the fabric of human society, becoming one of them, learning their ways. He played the role of the selfless protector, the hero willing to fight for the innocent, all while carefully gathering information. He needed to understand the world he would one day help conquer. He studied their weaknesses, their political divisions, their reliance on outdated technology, their inability to unify against larger threats. He learned their strengths, their adaptability, their ingenuity, the rare few individuals who might have been capable of putting up some form of resistance. And then there were the superhumans. Nolan had not expected them. When he arrived, he had assumed that he would be the sole being of true power on this planet, a god among mortals. But Earth was not as defenseless as he had initially believed. There were others, individuals with abilities that, while still inferior to a Viltrumite, could not be ignored. The Guardians of the Globe were the most notable among them. They were organized, powerful, and capable of standing against threats that would have otherwise decimated human civilization. This complicated things. If Earth were to be taken, they would need to be neutralized. So Nolan watched them. He observed their strengths, their weaknesses, their dynamics. He learned their tactics, their limitations, and most importantly, their blind spots. They were powerful, yes, but they were not prepared for something like him. They had never faced a Viltrumite. Still, direct action would have been premature. The Guardians were not his only concern. His mission required patience. If Earth was to be prepared for Viltrumite rule, it needed to be done properly. The population had to be conditioned, their dependence on him deepened, their perception of strength reshaped. And so he continued his work. As Omni-Man, he fought threats both great and small. He became the planet's most reliable defender, a figure of awe and admiration. The people loved him, saw him as a savior, a symbol of power and security. Every battle, every life he saved, further cemented his place in their world. It was necessary. The more they trusted him, the more they relied on him, the less they would resist when the time came. But there were times when Nolan could not help but feel the weight of it all. Decades had passed. He had spent so much time among them, longer than he had ever expected. He had built a life, formed bonds that should have meant nothing, and yet, something about it all gnawed at him. Debbie, Mark, none of it had been real, not truly. And yet, the moments he shared with them, the laughter, the quiet nights, the simple pleasures of a human existence, they felt real. He hated that. It was weakness. And the Viltrumite Empire did not tolerate weakness. When Mark was born, the mission took on a new dimension. Nolan had always assumed he would complete his work alone, but now he had something he had never expected: a successor. Mark was Viltrumite, not fully, but enough. He was strong, he had potential, and most importantly, he could be molded. If Mark embraced his heritage, he could make Earth's transition far smoother. Together, they could ensure humanity's surrender without unnecessary destruction. But Mark was raised human. Nolan saw the softness in him, the attachment to his mortal life, the idealism that made him believe in justice, in kindness, in the naive fantasy that strength was meant to serve the weak. It disgusted him, but he understood. He had lived among these people long enough to know how they thought, how they warped minds into weakness. He had been careful, planting the seeds of Viltrumite ideology early, preparing Mark for the truth that would inevitably come. Still, he knew that one day his son would have to make a choice. Mark would either accept his destiny, or he would stand in his way. And if it was the latter, Nolan had spent years carefully balancing his roles. To the world, he was a hero. To his family, he was a husband and father. But beneath it all, he remained what he had always been, a conqueror in waiting. The mission was not yet complete, but the time was drawing near. The world had no idea what was coming. To them, the Guardians of the Globe were the ultimate protectors, an unwavering line of defense against any force that might threaten the peace of Earth. They were the strongest of the strong, a team of heroes whose powers ranged from superhuman strength and speed to control over the elements themselves. They were humanity's shield, their safety net, their hope. But all that hope was about to be shattered violently in the dead of night. It began with the call. Nolan had waited for the right moment. He had spent years carefully observing the Guardians, assessing their abilities and their weaknesses. They were powerful, yes, but they were not invincible. And in the end, they were only human. That made them susceptible, vulnerable in ways they could not see. Nolan knew that the Viltrumite Empire could not afford to leave any loose ends. Earth needed to be brought under control, but before that could happen, the Guardians had to be eliminated. They were too strong to be ignored, too organized to be left unchecked. So the plan had been set in motion. The night he had chosen was deliberate. The Guardians were scattered across the world, but they had gathered in their headquarters for what seemed like a routine meeting. Nolan's presence in their world had always been regarded as one of safety and protection. He was their ally, their friend, and though there had been subtle tensions between them, rumors of his true intentions, his heritage, no one could have anticipated what would unfold that night. They had trusted him. The doors of their headquarters opened to him, and Nolan stepped inside. He was dressed as he always was. His costume, the unmistakable red and blue of Omni-Man, the symbol of power and authority. His face was calm, unreadable, his posture commanding, yet there was a certain serenity in his demeanor. To the Guardians, there was nothing alarming about his appearance. They knew him as a hero, just as they were. They didn't question his motives, didn't doubt his loyalty. But Nolan wasn't there to join them. He was there to destroy them. He didn't waste a moment. There were no words of explanation, no speeches about their failure to understand their place in the universe. Nolan had never been one for theatrics. The moment he entered, he was already in motion. His speed was overwhelming, his strikes devastating, his precision deadly. First, he turned to the leader of the Guardians, Immortal, the man who stood as the pinnacle of heroism, revered by the world for his strength and resilience. But Immortal had no chance. Nolan moved faster than the eye could follow, closing the distance in an instant. His fist connected with Immortal's chest with such force that the sound of the impact echoed throughout the room, a sickening thud that left no room for doubt. Immortal's body was sent crashing through the walls of the headquarters, his ribs cracking under the pressure, his organs torn apart by the sheer power behind the blow. The others were still reacting, still trying to process what was happening, when Nolan moved again. Green Ghost tried to phase through the walls to escape, but Nolan was faster. He grabbed her by the throat, squeezing until her body went limp, her powers unable to save her. Martian Man and Aquarius attempted to form a plan, but Nolan struck them with brutal efficiency. The Martian, powerful in his own right, found himself torn apart by the force of Nolan's blows. His body reduced to little more than a bloody smear as Nolan battered him with overwhelming strength. Aquarius, too, had no chance to use her water-based powers. Nolan crushed her with the same savage speed. Her body snapped in half under his attack. Then came War Woman. She was fierce, driven by a warrior spirit, but that meant nothing in the face of Nolan's power. He met her with an explosion of raw strength, smashing through her defenses as though they were made of paper. She had barely a moment to react before he sent her flying into the ceiling, her body slamming into the concrete with a sickening crack. The last of the Guardians, Duplicate, fought back valiantly. She created multiple clones of herself, each one trying to overwhelm Nolan with numbers. But Nolan was far beyond their combined efforts. One by one, he tore through them, each clone vanishing as she was crushed under his fists, her body mangled beyond recognition. It was quick, too quick for any of them to mount a true defense. There were no second chances, no opportunities for escape. Nolan had spent years calculating this moment, and when it arrived, there was no hesitation. He had trained himself to be a master of efficiency, and in a matter of minutes, the most powerful heroes on the planet lay broken, dead, or dying at his feet. The building was silent now. Nolan stood in the center, his breathing slow, controlled, his chest rising and falling with each breath. There was no sense of triumph, no celebration. This was just what needed to be done. But there was something lingering in the air, something faint, a presence that Nolan hadn't expected. Mark had arrived. He had been tracking his father's movements, growing suspicious of the increasing violence and the coldness he had begun to see in Nolan's actions. When he arrived at the headquarters, he found only the aftermath, the destruction, the bloodshed, the broken bodies of the Guardians. And then he saw his father standing in the center of it all. Mark froze. His mind couldn't process what he was seeing. He had grown up admiring the Guardians, looking up to them as the embodiment of everything good in the world. They were the heroes, the defenders of Earth. And now they were gone, brutally slaughtered by the very man who had always claimed to protect them. "Dad?" Mark's voice cracked. Nolan turned to face his son, his expression unreadable. There was no regret in his eyes, no sign of hesitation. He was simply a man who had completed his mission. "They were weak," Nolan said, his voice cold, detached. "This world was never going to survive without us." Mark's heart sank. The reality of what his father had just done, what he had been preparing him for, was finally clear. Nolan had killed them, not because they were a threat, but because they stood in the way of what he truly believed was the only future for Earth. For the first time, Mark saw the full extent of what it meant to be a Viltrumite. It was not about protecting the innocent, not about saving the world. It was about conquest, about imposing the will of the strong on the weak. The night was thick with tension. Chicago, once bustling with life, now lay under a heavy shadow of uncertainty. The aftermath of the brutal massacre of the Guardians of the Globe still hung in the air, the weight of Nolan's betrayal like a palpable presence in every corner of the city. Mark, standing in the wreckage of what had once been a place of safety, felt his heart thundering in his chest. His hands trembled, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of what had just transpired. His father, Nolan, stood across from him, his face unreadable, cold. The man who had raised him, the man he had admired and trusted above all else, was now a stranger, a monster wearing the face of a hero. Mark's mind struggled to process it all, but the reality of the situation was undeniable. The Guardians were dead, slaughtered by his own father, and now it was his turn to face him. He could feel the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. There would be no more pretending, no more denial. The truth was right in front of him. "Why, Dad?" Mark's voice cracked as he spoke, the words a mix of anger and confusion. "Why did you do this?" "They were trying to protect people. They were heroes. You killed them." Nolan's expression was still impassive. His eyes locked onto Mark with a chilling calmness. There was no sign of remorse, no guilt in his gaze. Only the cold, calculating look of someone who had completed a task, someone who had done what was necessary. "They were weak," Nolan said, his voice steady, almost detached. "This world doesn't need them. It needs strength. It needs order. The Viltrumite Empire is the only future for this planet. You'll see that, Mark. You'll understand soon enough." Mark's fists clenched, his mind racing, the anger building within him like a storm. This wasn't the father he knew. This wasn't the man who had raised him, who had taught him to do what was right. This was something else entirely. The ideals Nolan had once instilled in him, of justice, of protecting the innocent, had been shattered in an instant, replaced by an ideology that Mark could never accept. "No," Mark said, his voice shaking with emotion. "I can't accept this. You've lost it. The world doesn't need to be conquered. It doesn't need to be ruled by fear. We're supposed to protect people, not destroy them." For the first time, Nolan's expression shifted. His eyes darkened, his jaw tightening as he took a step forward. There was a flicker of something in his gaze, something that might have been disappointment, or perhaps something more dangerous. But whatever it was fleeting. "You're wrong," Nolan said, his voice growing colder. "You're too soft, Mark. You've been raised with their weakness. I've tried to teach you, but you don't understand. This is the way the universe works. The strong survive, the weak perish. I came here to prepare this planet for the Viltrumite Empire, and I'll do whatever it takes to see it happen. If you want to stop me, then you'll have to face me." Mark took a step back, his chest heaving as he processed his father's words. The man he had once looked up to had become everything he feared, a symbol of ruthless strength, of cold pragmatism. Nolan was no longer his father. He was a threat, an unstoppable force, and Mark knew what he had to do. But the decision weighed heavily on him. He didn't want to fight his father. He didn't want to hurt him. Nolan was the man who had taught him how to be strong, how to use his powers to protect people. But that man was gone now, replaced by someone who cared only for power, for control. And Mark could no longer stand by and let it happen. With a sudden burst of energy, Mark launched himself at Nolan. The force of the punch was enough to crack the concrete beneath them, sending a shockwave through the air. But Nolan was ready. He sidestepped with terrifying speed, grabbing Mark by the arm and throwing him through the side of a building. The impact was deafening, sending chunks of stone and debris flying in all directions. Mark struggled to regain his bearings, his body aching from the brutal hit, but his resolve only hardened. He wasn't backing down. Mark shot back into the air, charging at Nolan with all the strength he could muster. His fists collided with Nolan's chest, but the older Viltrumite barely flinched. Nolan's eyes narrowed, and with a single crushing blow, he sent Mark spiraling into the ground, leaving a massive crater where the impact occurred. Blood trickled from Mark's mouth as he struggled to stand, every inch of his body screaming in pain. But the pain was nothing compared to the weight of the decision he had just made. He was fighting for what he believed in, for the Earth, for the people he loved, for everything his father had once stood for. But Nolan wasn't finished. He closed the distance between them in an instant, grabbing Mark by the throat and lifting him off the ground. Mark gasped for air, his vision swimming as his father's grip tightened. Nolan's eyes were cold, calculating. There was no love in them, only the harsh reality of the Viltrumite belief system. Mark could feel his body weakening under the pressure, the air being squeezed out of his lungs. His father wasn't holding back. He wasn't pulling punches. "You still don't get it," Nolan said, his voice low and cold. "You're just like them, weak. You don't have what it takes to rule this planet. You're soft, Mark, and I'll break you if I have to." Mark's vision blurred, his mind struggling to stay focused, but something inside him snapped. He refused to die like this, to let his father win. With every last ounce of strength, he punched Nolan in the face, the impact so powerful it made Nolan stagger back. Mark dropped to the ground, gasping for air, his body aching, but he wasn't finished. His fists clenched as he stood once more, determination burning in his eyes. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. Nolan straightened, wiping blood from his lip, a look of annoyance crossing his face. He had expected this. He had always known Mark was strong, but he had underestimated just how much of a fight his son would put up. Nolan's expression hardened. This wasn't about saving Earth anymore. It wasn't about anything other than proving a point, about showing Mark what it meant to be truly strong. The battle raged on. Punch after punch, they collided in the air, each one more devastating than the last. Mark could feel the world around him crumbling, buildings falling, the ground shaking beneath them. Their fight had become a war zone, the destruction around them a reflection of the chaos within. They were no longer father and son. They were two forces locked in an inevitable clash, each trying to impose their vision on the world. The city of Chicago lay in ruins, the sky bruised with the dark echoes of battle. The remnants of buildings, shattered streets, and broken glass were a haunting testament to the violence that had unfolded. The air itself felt heavy, laden with the aftermath of what had transpired between father and son. Mark Grayson, battered and bloodied, stood amidst the wreckage, his mind still reeling from the fight. He could barely feel the physical pain anymore. What hurt more was the weight of the decision that had led to this moment. His father, Nolan, the Viltrumite, had abandoned him, the earth, and everything they had once known. The fight had been intense, brutal beyond anything Mark had ever imagined. Nolan, a creature of almost unmatched strength, had made it clear that his allegiance was no longer with Earth or humanity. His coldness, his belief in the Viltrumite doctrine of survival of the fittest, had become an irreparable rift between them. And when the battle had finally ended, Mark's body had been a canvas of bruises and blood, his mind fractured from the weight of the confrontation. Nolan had left, flying into the sky with the force of a storm, leaving his son lying in the wreckage below. In that moment, Mark was lost. It wasn't just the physical toll of the battle that hurt. It was the knowledge that his father, the man who had raised him, had chosen the Empire over his family. Nolan had abandoned Earth, leaving his own flesh and blood to grapple with the devastation he had wrought. There was no redemption for Nolan in that moment. No hope that Mark could bring his father back to the side of good. The reality settled deep within Mark's chest, a cold, unforgiving truth. Nolan wasn't coming back. Days passed, and the world around Mark seemed to continue moving, despite the emotional weight that pressed upon him. He returned home, the place where his mother, Debbie, still tried to keep life as normal as possible. The house, however, felt emptier than ever before. It was as if Nolan's absence was a void that could never be filled. Debbie, heartbroken but resolute, did her best to continue on for Mark's sake. But even she knew that nothing would ever be the same. She had seen the brutality in Nolan's eyes, had felt the sting of his betrayal in her own bones. Her trust in the man she had once loved had crumbled, and what remained was only the shell of a family, shattered by the actions of someone who had once been their protector. Mark spent hours in his room, staring out of his window at the horizon, his mind unable to process the events that had unfolded. His body healed, but the psychological scars were far deeper. The weight of what had happened, what he had done, pressed on him relentlessly. In his heart, he knew he had done the right thing, but there was a part of him that couldn't escape the nagging feeling of loss. His father wasn't just a symbol of strength anymore. He was a villain, a monster, and yet, Mark couldn't completely shut out the memories of the good times, the lessons Nolan had taught him, the love that had once been there. The media, of course, reported on the destruction in Chicago, the fight between the so-called heroes, and the aftermath of what they deemed a superpowered conflict. But the true nature of what had transpired wasn't fully understood by the public. No one knew that the man who had fought to protect Earth had been an imposter, a false hero with his own agenda. And no one knew how deeply it cut to have one's father become the enemy. The people of Earth couldn't comprehend the pain Mark was enduring. How could they? They were just looking for answers to the violence they had witnessed. Mark, however, had no answers. He only had the remnants of a relationship that no longer existed. And then came the guilt. Mark couldn't stop wondering if he had missed something, if he had failed to reach his father in time, if there was a chance to change Nolan's mind. He had tried to stop the massacre of the Guardians of the Globe, to prevent the brutal killing spree that Nolan had set in motion. But there had been no stopping him. Mark had confronted Nolan, tried to reason with him, but it was too late. The man who had been a symbol of hope and strength had become a force of destruction, and now Mark was left to pick up the pieces. In the weeks that followed, Mark took on more responsibility, not just as Invincible, but as the protector of Earth in a way he hadn't imagined. With Nolan gone, the world needed someone to stand in his place. Mark wasn't sure he was ready for it, but he had no choice. The weight of his father's absence was a constant reminder that he couldn't afford to let up. There were still threats out there, still dangers lurking in the shadows, and he was the only one left who could fight them. But it was more than that. Mark was driven by something deeper now. The loss of Nolan had transformed him. It wasn't just about saving the world anymore. It was about proving that humanity had a place in the universe, that it wasn't destined to be ruled by the Viltrumites. Nolan's actions, his cold belief in survival of the fittest, had to be opposed. Mark would be the one to do it, even if it meant facing the darkness alone. But the world around Mark was changing, too. As he fought against villains and other threats, he began to see that the aftermath of Nolan's departure wasn't just about Mark picking up the pieces. It was about Earth itself learning to cope with the void left behind. People had seen Invincible take down massive threats before, but they hadn't seen him take on something as personal as this. Nolan had been one of their greatest defenders. Now he was gone, and Mark had to shoulder not just the responsibility of protecting Earth, but the legacy his father had left behind. Mark wasn't the only one affected by Nolan's departure. The remaining members of the Guardians of the Globe, though mourning the loss of their teammates, began to see Mark as their new leader. His determination, his ability to continue the fight, made them realize that while they had lost a father figure in Nolan, they had gained a powerful ally in Invincible. But there was still so much that Mark had to learn. He was still young, still coming to grips with the enormity of what had happened, and the pressure on him was immense. Debbie, too, struggled. Nolan's absence left a hole in her heart that nothing could fill. She tried to continue with life, to be there for Mark, but the truth of Nolan's betrayal haunted her. She had loved him, had believed in him, and now she was left with the crushing knowledge that the man she had once shared everything with was a false hero, a man who had turned his back on his own family. Nolan Grayson, now a figure cast in the shadows of his former life, found himself in a place he never thought he would be, far from Earth, far from the life he had built for himself. Thraxa was a world located deep within Viltrumite space, far away from the chaos he had left behind. The planet itself was not like Earth in many ways, its landscape barren, with towering mountains and desolate plains that seemed to stretch endlessly. The air was thick, with a tint of red dust that clung to everything. The sky was a shade of orange, tinged with the constant glare of two suns that hung high above. The planet felt alive in a way that Earth never had, but it was also desolate, its surface scarred by a violent history of warfare and conquest. It was here, in this isolated corner of the universe, that Nolan sought refuge. The same man who had stood as one of the Viltrumite Empire's most feared warriors had now been cast aside by his own people, abandoned by the ideals he once believed in. No longer the hero he had pretended to be on Earth, Nolan was left with the aftermath of his own choices. And so, he tried to carve out a new life for himself on Thraxa. A life that was meant to be a rebirth, a place where he could start again, far from the empire he had helped build, far from the son he had betrayed. Thraxa wasn't welcoming, at least not at first. Nolan was an outsider here, exiled not just by the Viltrumite Empire but by his own failures. The world was populated by beings who were not quite as powerful as the Viltrumites, but who had their own sense of strength and pride. The inhabitants of Thraxa were a warrior-like people, survivors of battles long past. They had seen destruction, had felt the touch of war, and had learned to live with it. To them, Nolan was a curiosity, a giant among them, someone whose presence seemed to loom over their small settlements like a dark cloud. But Nolan didn't see them as enemies. He didn't even view them as conquerable. They were different from the Viltrumites, people who had suffered much like he had. He found himself connecting with them, not through strength, but through the shared pain of a broken past. They didn't know his full history, no one here did, but they saw his strength, and in their way they respected it. Over time, Nolan found solace in their acceptance, however tentative it may have been. It wasn't long before Nolan met a woman named Nara, a Thraxian who had once been a warrior herself, but now served as a leader of a small village. She was strong in ways that Nolan had never expected, capable of standing up to him, of challenging him when others would have bowed before his might. Her fiery spirit intrigued him, and over time, a bond began to form between them. Nara had seen the ugliness of war, the devastation that it caused, and like Nolan, she longed for something better. She had been the one to find him when he first arrived on Thraxa, broken and lost. Nara had been a leader, a protector of her people. She understood that strength came in many forms, and with time she came to understand Nolan in a way that no one else had. She didn't see him as the Viltrumite warrior that had terrorized countless worlds. She saw him as someone who had been broken by his own actions, someone who had been lost to his own ideals. But Nara also saw the potential for redemption in Nolan. She had seen enough to know that there was always room for change, even in the most unlikely of places. Nolan's time with Nara marked the beginning of a strange new chapter in his life. They weren't lovers, not at first. Instead, they were two broken people, struggling to find a place in a world that had left them behind. Nolan's sense of identity had been tied to the Viltrumite Empire for so long that he didn't know what life would be like without it. But Nara's presence gave him a reason to try, a reason to rebuild. She helped him understand that he could exist outside of the identity that had consumed him for so long. There was more to him than just a warrior. There was more to him than the violence he had committed in the name of the Viltrumite cause. Over time, Nolan's relationship with Nara deepened. It was slow at first, hesitant, but as they spent more time together, they began to form a bond built not on strength or survival, but on mutual understanding. Nara became the anchor Nolan had needed for so long, and in turn, Nolan began to teach her the things he knew, the lessons of leadership, the strategies of warfare, the mind of a Viltrumite warrior. He taught her how to fight not just with strength, but with intelligence and precision. In the years that followed, Nolan found a new sense of purpose on Thraxa. It wasn't the same purpose he had once had on Earth, fighting for the Viltrumite cause, trying to dominate the universe. No, this was something different. This was about survival, about building something that could last, something that didn't rely on conquest or destruction. Together, Nolan and Nara worked to rebuild their world. They worked to make it a better place, one step at a time, one life at a time. And then, as if fate had caught up with him, Nolan's world expanded once more. Nara became pregnant with their child, a child that would be a symbol of hope, not just for Nolan and Nara, but for the future of Thraxa itself. The idea of family was something Nolan had long since abandoned, something he had thought was out of reach for someone like him. But here, on Thraxa, he had a chance to build a new legacy. This child, their child, would carry the weight of their past, but it would also carry the hope of their future. Nolan was no longer just a warrior. He was a father. But even in this new life, Nolan was haunted. The echoes of his past, the legacy of the Viltrumites, were never far from his mind. He had once been part of a greater empire, part of a cause that had taken him across the universe. Now, he was a man living on the fringes of that empire, a man who had once stood at the top and had fallen so far from grace. He had abandoned the Viltrumite cause, but he couldn't escape the fact that it would always be a part of him. The shadows of his past were long, and they clung to him like a second skin. Still, he tried. For Nara, for their child, for the future of Thraxa. The past was something he could not undo, but the future, he could shape that. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He had a new family, a new purpose, and while the ghosts of his past would always be there, he had found something worth fighting for. In the end, that was all that mattered. The decision to defy the Viltrumite Empire did not come easily to Nolan Grayson. For years, he had followed the orders of the Viltrumite leadership, each act of conquest solidifying his belief in their cause. He had been taught that the Viltrumites were the superior race, the rightful rulers of the universe. The peace he had found on Thraxa with Nara and their child had been a fragile illusion, a break from his past. But even in those quiet moments, he could never entirely escape his past. Nolan's time on Thraxa had changed him in ways that even he could not fully understand. It was not just the presence of Nara, nor the weight of becoming a father, that had shifted his perspective. It was the growing realization that the Viltrumite Empire, the empire he had once believed in so deeply, was not the righteous force he had been led to think it was. The conquest, the destruction, the bloodshed, it had all been a lie. The Viltrumites had preached about superiority, about the survival of the fittest, but Nolan saw the truth more clearly now. Their methods weren't about ensuring the best, but about crushing the weak and growing stronger at any cost. The more he lived among the people of Thraxa, the more he realized that their ideals were not just wrong, they were monstrous. The tipping point came one evening, as Nolan sat by the window of their small, modest home on Thraxa, watching the orange sunset. The weight of his past felt heavier than ever, pressing down on him like a stone. Nara, who had been spending time in the village, returned quietly and stood beside him. He didn't speak at first, the thoughts swirling in his head too turbulent for words. But Nara could see it in his eyes. She could sense the conflict he had been carrying for weeks, perhaps even longer. She knew the man she had come to love had been a different person than the one who had landed on Thraxa years ago, broken and defeated. But that didn't mean the past could be forgotten. "Something's been eating at you for a while," she said softly, standing beside him, her hand gently resting on his shoulder. "What is it?" Nolan turned to her, his expression hardening. "I'm being hunted, Nara, not just by the Viltrumites, but by everything I've done in their name." His voice was strained, raw, as if he were trying to confess something he didn't fully understand himself. "They won't let me go. They'll never let me walk away from the empire I helped build. I've betrayed them, and I know what they'll do when they find me. When they find us." Nara's face softened, but she didn't flinch. "And what will you do?" Nolan's gaze hardened. "I don't know if I can keep running anymore. They won't stop until they're certain I'm gone. But I can't go back. I've seen too much of what they're capable of. I've seen how they destroy everything in their path, how they leave nothing but ashes behind." His hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white with the pressure. "I won't be a part of it anymore. I can't. Not after everything I've learned. I can't continue to pretend that what we're doing is right." The silence between them stretched on for what felt like an eternity. But Nara, always the steady force, understood. She had seen his struggle, the way he had tried to reconcile the man he had been with the man he was becoming. She knew that for Nolan, this wasn't just about survival, it was about redemption. It was about coming to terms with the blood on his hands, the countless lives he had destroyed in the name of a cause that had never been just. "You're not alone in this," Nara said, her voice steady. "I'll stand by you whatever comes. But if you're going to do this, you have to commit fully. You have to take a stand, not just for yourself, but for everything you've lost." Nolan looked at her, his heart heavy with the burden of his decision. He knew what she was asking of him, what it would mean for their future. The Viltrumites would never forgive him. They would never let him walk away from their war, not without consequences. But Nara was right. There could be no half measures. If he was to find redemption, if he was to ever make things right, it had to start with this decision. He couldn't keep living in fear of his past. He had to face it head on, no matter the cost. "I've seen what they've done," Nolan said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've seen the way they treat entire worlds, the way they destroy everything in their path. It's not just about power or conquest, it's about control. And I won't be a part of it anymore." Nara nodded, her expression resolute. "Then you have to make your choice. It's not going to be easy, but if you're ready to fight for something better, I'm with you." The decision was made. Nolan Grayson, once one of the most feared warriors of the Viltrumite Empire, made the choice to defy everything he had once believed in. He would no longer be a tool of destruction, no longer a pawn in their cruel game of conquest. He would fight against the empire he had helped build, not just for his own redemption, but for the future of the universe. A future that didn't have to be defined by violence, by empire, by the endless hunger for power. It wasn't long before the consequences of his decision became clear. The Viltrumites, upon learning of Nolan's defection, would come for him with a wrath that only they could unleash. But Nolan was ready. He knew what was at stake. He had spent too many years serving a cause that had corrupted everything he once held dear. Now he would take a stand, not just for himself, but for the people of Thraxa, for Nara, and for the future he had come to believe in. The battle for Nolan's redemption had only just begun, and there would be no turning back. The universe would tremble in the wake of his choice, for no one, least of all the Viltrumites, would ever forget the betrayal of one of their own. But Nolan was ready for what lay ahead. He had made his choice, and for the first time in years, he finally felt like he had a purpose again.